Shall we go ahead and get started?
Sure.
Okay, so let me just pull up my notes. There we go. Okay, so just to make an announcement before we get started, if everybody could please mute your microphones for now until we get to the Q&A when you have a question, if you have a question. You can also feel free to mute your videos to save your bandwidth. We'll be recording the talk to post afterwards, so just be aware that if you ask a question audibly, that we'll be recording. But if you want to ask a question but you don't want to ask a question audibly, we do have the chat feature, so you can ask questions that way. Erin has said that she's open to clarifying questions during the talk, but please hold your substantive questions, longer questions after the talk. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce Erin. So Erin Hatton is an associate professor of sociology at SUNY Buffalo. Her areas of expertise are work and labor markets, labor and labor movements, law and social policy, race, gender, class, and inequality. She is the author of The Temp Economy, From Kelly Girls to Permatemps in Post-War America from 2011. And she is today talking about her new book, Coerced, Work Under Threat of Punishment. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Erin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. Just as a logistical point, I'm not sure how I'll see questions if you ask during the talk when I have a slideshow. Does anyone know if I'll see them?
I can go ahead and let you know. I have the chat feature open, so if you can't see it, then I'll let you know.
All right, perfect. So yes, I'm so happy to be here today. And as you noted, I am mostly a work and labor scholar. So although I do, with this project, reach into the prison system, I hope that this is of interest to you, although really my research is centered on the sociology of work. Okay, so in this project, which is now a book, just out during this pandemic, I look at prisoners, welfare recipients, student athletes, and graduate students. And specifically, I compare them as workers. I look at their labor relations and the power dynamics that undergird all of these labor relations. And ultimately, I argue that all of these workers experience the same type of labor coercion. But I want to say here at the outset, before I jump into my talk, that I do not argue that these workers are really the same in any way, certainly not in terms of their social marginalization and their vulnerability. Prisoners are far removed from graduate students, right? College athletes are not the same. They do not experience the same things that welfare recipients and prisoners do. But in this book, I do argue that they experience the same type of labor coercion in kind, but not intensity. Just as lower level workers and upper level managers both experience economic coercion in kind, but not intensity, right? So they're experiencing a similar thing, but their experience of it is dramatically different because of their vulnerability and marginalization. But in point of fact, with this project, I didn't actually set out to study labor coercion. I was initially interested in examining those workers who perform labor, but who are not protected by labor and employment laws. So first, I interviewed recently released prisoners about the labor they performed behind bars, for as we all know, most able-bodied prisoners are required to work. Then I interviewed welfare recipients who are required to participate in, usually they're called work experience programs, as a condition of their receipt of welfare, often known as workfare workers. Then later, after a few detours, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, I interviewed student athletes, specifically former Division I basketball and football players. And then I interviewed former graduate students in the sciences, the life sciences, biology, chemistry, and so on. And through these more than 120 interviews, I discovered that the dynamics that most immediately shaped their work lives was not exactly their exclusion from labor and employment laws, which is what I set out to study, although that exclusion was important. But really it was the power that their bosses wielded over them, the type of punishments that their bosses could wield. Really, it became about the coercion under which they labored. But in point of fact, most work and labor scholars today don't really talk a whole lot about labor coercion. It's considered a bit passé, and it's simply taken as a given that economic coercion undergirds labor relations in capitalist economies. And with this foundation implicitly in place, the primary story of work and labor in America and elsewhere in the globe today is one of precarity, the instability, the insecurity, and the low wages of gig work and temp work and freelancing and adjunct labor and just-in-time scheduling and more, right? The story is about precarity, and this is what our research is centered on. But these dynamics of precarity were not the ones that were shaping the work lives of the workers I interviewed. In prison, for example, much more than being worried about losing their jobs and the wages or losing the number of hours they could work each week, they were concerned with the power that their bosses or corrections officers wielded over them. Because really, if they didn't comply with virtually any demand from their boss, from their corrections officer while they were at work, regardless of the nature of that demand, they would face a range of punitive consequences. They could lose access to family visits and socializing, they could lose access to recreation and movement, they could lose access to their ability to buy basic food and toiletries from the commissary. And they lost this through a variety of mechanisms, right? They could be fined tickets, which is usually amount to about a week's worth of wages, at least in New York State prisons, and that's where I did my prison interviews. They could be put on keep lock, confined to their own cell, or they could be put in solitary confinement. And so they lose through these mechanisms, they lose many of the basic human entitlements that become privileges behind bars. They lose access to friends and socializing and family. They lose access to edible food. And losing these privileges is not at all uncommon behind bars, right? We know this. Being put in solitary is actually quite a common consequence for these workers, as well as just for prisoners in general when they're not at work as well. This is the type of power that their bosses wield over them. Now, in workfare, if workfare workers do not comply with virtually any demand from either their caseworkers or their workfare supervisors, they can be sanctioned. That is, they lose access to key social assistance programs such as cash benefits, rent and utility subsidies, healthcare, food, childcare, and transportation subsidies. In other words, all of the programs which are essential to families in poverty. Now, although these sanctions are usually temporary, their effects are permanent. Under TANF, they reduce welfare recipients' lifetime allotment of public assistance. And of course, there are long-term consequences of extreme material hardship, including homelessness. And in New York City, if you're sanctioned and living in a homeless shelter, you'll be kicked out of the homeless shelter altogether. So there are extreme consequences for these workers and their families for being sanctioned. Their bosses, just as for prisoners, wield a great deal of power over them. Meanwhile, for the two groups of university student workers in the study, the student athletes and the graduate students in the sciences, the punitive power that their bosses wield is much less severe, though it is still far-reaching and punitive in nature. So for athletes, for example, if they don't comply with their coach's directives, they will likely lose their playing time, their ability to compete in their sport at an elite level. And for most of them, this is their only chance to compete. They're not going to go on to play professionally. But if they don't play, they'll also lose any chance at professional recruitment, since recruiters are coming to the games to watch them play. If they're not playing, they don't get recruited. Also, similar to in graduate school, their coaches effectively give professional recruiters informal letters of recommendation. They don't write letters, but they're verbal recommendations. And if the college athlete is causing problems, not doing what they say, not falling in line as an athlete, they will not recommend them to play professionally. So they have quite a bit of power over whether they can play in the present and in the future. And they also, of course, control their scholarships. And thus they can revoke these students' access to subsidized university education and the accreditation it confers. Now, the same is broadly true for PhD students in the sciences. If they don't comply with their advisor's directives, they will likely have trouble staying in graduate school, getting their education, completing their degree, also publishing papers and obtaining future jobs through the letters of recommendation, which are a quite powerful mechanism of control. Now, of course, not all faculty advisors, coaches, caseworkers, and corrections officers deploy these punitive powers. At least they don't all do so in mean-spirited ways. But those who do are not bad apples. They are not exceptions to the rule. They are the rule. This is simply how things are done in these workplaces. Their access to such expansive punitive power is simply a matter of course in these labor relations. And as a result, it often remains unquestioned by workers and supervisors alike. If a prisoner doesn't follow an officer's orders, he may very well be put in solitary confinement, regardless of the content of that order. If a workfare worker does not adhere to her supervisor's directives, she'll likely be sanctioned. If an athlete doesn't comply with her coach's dictates, she will likely lose playing time and her scholarship could be revoked. If a graduate student does not comply or follow his advisor's directives, he may very well lose his advisor's support for future employment. His career is at stake. Thus, I argue that all of these workers labor under the threat of punishment. Whether or not they experience such punishment firsthand, these workers are acutely aware of the power that their bosses wield, and this awareness pervades the workplace, fundamentally shaping their actions and experiences. Their labor is coerced. But this type of coercion that I'm talking about here is different from economic coercion, the main type of coercion that we implicitly accept in labor relations, because economic coercion is predicated on employers' power to hire, promote, and demote workers. Degree of economic coercion, in as much as they rely on or the wages or whatever kind of counts for wages in their work, whether it's the basic stipends that university students get or the cash benefits that workers get, or at least in New York State, incarcerated workers are paid minimal wages. But that's not the main threat for these workers. The loss of those wages or stipends is not their main concern. It's these other forms of power that their bosses wield. I call this form of coercion status coercion, because at the heart of these power dynamics that I've been discussing is the fact that the supervisors of these labor relations can discharge these workers from a particular status as a prisoner, as a social assistance recipient, as a college athlete, or as a graduate student in good standing, and thereby deprive them of the rights, privileges, and opportunities that those statuses confer. In point of fact, all of these workers, as kind of came up from my original research design, all of these workers do not occupy the status of worker under labor and employment law. So they don't get the minimum wage, they don't get overtime, they don't have the right to organize and bargain collectively. Instead, they occupy a variety of other statuses, each of which has its own constraints, obligations, as well as privileges and rights. Now, to be sure, such statuses are not always desirable, right? No one actually wants to occupy the status of prisoner. But once you're living behind bars, maintaining one's status as a prisoner in good standing is desirable indeed, because it gives them access to all those human entitlements that become privileges behind bars, privileges which can be revoked. So as I said before, if being a prisoner in good standing allows prisoners to sustain relationships with their family and friends through phone use, visitation, and interaction with fellow prisoners, and family visits. It also gives them access to activity, recreation, and freedom of movement, albeit constrained. It gives them access to money, food, and consumer goods. And it gives them access to early release from prison through parole or commutation, right? You have to have good behavior behind bars to be eligible for parole. But you can't be eligible for parole if you're put in solitary confinement for not following an order. Thus, although prisoner is not a desirable status, as it imposes many more constraints than privileges, when living behind bars, you must maintain your status as a good prisoner to retain access to all of those privileges that they sorely need. These other statuses that I examine in the book are similar, for even when they impose constraints on their worker occupants, they also offer important rights and privileges. For workfare workers, for example, being a welfare recipient in good standing is the prerequisite for their continued access to key social safety net programs, and as I said before, even homeless shelters. Meanwhile, for Division I athletes, occupying that status in good standing gives them access to subsidized university education and its credentials, as well as the chance to play their sport, and for the few, lucky some, a chance at future fame and fortune through professional sports. Likewise, being a graduate student in good standing offers access to subsidized graduate education, as well as high status credentials, experience, training, and professional opportunities. Therefore, even though each of these statuses do not confer the right to a minimum wage or collective bargaining, as would the status of worker, these statuses do offer rights and privileges that are highly valued within their respective institutions. Yet in each of these cases, their supervisors have the capacity to revoke such rights and privileges, the consequences of which extend well beyond the job and its wages to affect these workers' lives, families, and futures in far-reaching ways. Now, of course, these are not the only labor relations that are characterized by what I'm calling here status coercion. In the US, for example, other examples include non-citizen workers, such as guest workers and undocumented workers, for whom US employers have de facto power of deportation. They can literally control their status as a worker or as a criminal to be deported and often separated from their family. But status coercion is not relegated to such unusual or extreme labor relations. Many conventional workers also experience status coercion, at least to some degree, since at the most basic level, being fired from one's job means being ejected from one's status as worker and all the privileges and rights and status that being a worker gives one in our society. Such loss of status can have significant psychological consequences for workers in addition to the economic consequences, especially for those who are deemed to be, who are culturally expected to be breadwinners. But for many workers, this loss of status is temporary, as they are free within constraints, at least, to find and accept other employment. For such workers, and losing the threat of losing their income or the economic coercion often overshadows the threat of losing one's status as worker, their status coercion. But this is not the case for everyone, right? For example, there's a growing use of non-compete clauses in the US, in which workers often unknowingly sign in their employment contract away their right to leave their job and go work for another employer in that same sector. When they do so, their employers then are able to wield power over these workers' ability to leverage their labor market experience and obtain future employment in their field of expertise. This is status coercion. So status coercion, for me, really came to the fore through examining these unusual types of workers who are excluded from labor and employment laws, but this type of coercion is not relegated to just these type of workers. You find it all over the place. Now for the rest of this talk, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the workers' experience of status coercion among the 4 groups of workers I studied in this book. Now for prisoners, the coercion that pervades their labor is perhaps best described by Garcia, a pseudonym. He's a 27-year-old Black and Hispanic man, and he described to me the Hobson's choice that prisoners face between solitary confinement and work. And he called solitary confinement the box, as many prisoners did. As Garcia said to me, the worst thing about working while incarcerated, I would have to say is, well, pretty much being forced. You're forced to do that work. It's up to you whether you don't look at it as that, but at the end of the day, and at the beginning of the day, you're forced to do all that. Like, you have no say-so. Either you do it or you go into the box. Either you do it or you get your ass whipped and then you go to the box. So it's really like they rule with an iron fist. You can rebel, but there's still going to be the same result. Now, as Garcia said here, you can rebel, and many of them did in both small and large ways, both in forms of overt resistance, subtle resistance, and also ideological resistance, all of which I examine in my book. But for the most part, I found these technologies of coercion that their bosses wielded over them were so effective that they effectively compelled their compliance. This is illustrated in a story told by the former prisoner Tim Jones. He was 28 years old, African American. While in prison, like most of the incarcerated workers I interviewed, Tim had worked in a variety of cleaning jobs, one of which included keeping the recreation area orderly. He was a rec aide. One day at work, he said, the corrections officer on duty asked him to do something weird, something that was outside of the norm, though at the time of our interview, he couldn't remember what it was. In describing the request, Tim said, it was just like some things you ask people to do outside their job description. It's like, okay, I'll do it, no problem. I'm not doing too much out here anyway. There was something he asked me that just seems like, huh? Like, excuse me? And I told him, I forgot exactly what it was, but I told him it's outside my job description, my job title. And he said, no, it's a direct order. And I said, but I'm here at work though, right? And he was like, yeah, you're at work, but I'm telling you to do it. As Tim told it, he then said, but say, what if I refuse due to the fact that it's not in my job title and I'm supposed to be technically at work? And the CO said, well, I'll put you on the wall. And Tim said, you put me on the wall, then what? What's the outcome? And the CO said, if I put you on the wall and you even flinch, you're not going to make your date. Tim said, I'm not going to have no good time regardless. So what are you trying to say to me? And the CO said, you know what I just said. So although at the end of this exchange, as Tim had recalled it to me, he had ascertained the CO's meaning, for those of us who may not entirely know, it takes a little bit of explanation. So the threat here, in fact, as Tim had come to understand, was not losing time off for good behavior, wasn't losing his parole date, because as Tim said, he didn't have any good time. He wasn't eligible for parole because he was in prison that time around for being a parole violator. Though, of course, losing your sentence reduction for good behavior is an explicit sanction for not complying with officer's orders. This is readily used. But this wasn't the threat here. The threat here was implicitly an additional criminal charge with an additional criminal sentence, as well as probably physical violence. Now, in order to understand why, you should know that, at least in New York State prisons, prisoners can be put on the wall for any reason at any time, usually in order to kind of shut down whatever's happening, to control a situation or to control a prisoner. And so when they're put on the wall, they have to lean forward at a 45-degree angle with their arms and legs outspread, and they can't move. Any movement will be seen as a threat to the officer, right? It is extremely important not to move. Because threats to officers are taken very, very seriously. And if you really, truly threaten an officer, you can catch another charge, as they would say, and end up in prison with another sentence. So the officer here is telling him that if you don't do what I say, this weird thing that I'm asking you to do, that's not even something you're supposed to do, I'm going to put you in the wall, and then I'm going to see you flinch, and then I'm going to call all the guards. We're going to subdue you with physical force, which is what happens when there's a threat to officers. We're going to throw you in the box. We're going to add you with a charge for assaulting or threatening an officer, and you're going to be in prison longer because you're not going to make your date, he told Tim. Now, in the end, Tim did what the officer said, but he also put in a request for a job change. And later, he even asked the officer why he had treated him this way. He told Tim that he had been testing his temper. Now, in workfare, if Pauline's supervisor had been trying to test her temper, she would be the first to tell you that she was the one who lost that battle. Pauline is an older African-American woman. Though she now works at a women's shelter, she used to receive public assistance, for which she was assigned to work 35 hours a week. First, she was assigned to clean at a nonprofit organization, and then she was assigned to pick up trash on the side of the highway. For this work, she received $374 a month in cash benefits, plus she also got food stamps for herself and her daughter. She said that doing workfare felt like slavery, though less because of the lack of paycheck, and more because of how workfare workers were treated. It was just degrading, she said, because they talked to you in any kind of way. It was just degrading. When I asked her to elaborate, she said that they would outright tell her she was lazy, that she wasn't trying hard enough. They would say, well, if you don't want to work, what do you think? That you're going to get free money? And she would say, but I had a job before where I paid taxes. Now I'm just down on my luck. Later in the interview, she explicitly compared workfare workers to those who have to do community service as part of their probation or parole. It's the same thing, she said, but for workfare workers, it's like they're convicting you for not having a job. One time, Pauline had to miss work. She was sick. She called in advance saying that she couldn't go, but because she didn't have a doctor's excuse, they cut off her benefits for 45 days, which under TANF, of course, cut her lifetime allotment of benefits. Then later, there came a hot summer day when she was out on the road picking up trash on the highway in the summer heat. She said that she felt like she was going to faint, so she asked her supervisor for a drink of water. The supervisor who drove the work crew out there every day wouldn't let her. It wasn't break time yet. She said, but they even give water to thirsty dogs. Can I just have a little bit of water? He wouldn't allow it. Break time wasn't for another 15 minutes. So she went to the van to get a drink of water anyway. He saw her, of course, as she knew he would, and he made her sit down for 10 minutes, which she did. But after the 10 minutes was up, she got up to go back to work because she knew that if she didn't do the work, regardless of the reason, right, even if he was the one who had told her to sit down, if she didn't do the work, she would be marked as non-compliant, and therefore she would be sanctioned again. And because this time it would be her second offense, she would lose benefits for 90 days, 3 full months. But as she got up to go back to work, he said, did I tell you to go back out there? By then, she'd had enough. She lost it. She said, I'm about sick of you yelling at me with your smart mouth. He said to her, as she recalled, I'm not the one who needs this. You're the one who needs this. I get a paycheck every month. So she told him where he could stick his paycheck. In the end, he made her sit in the van for the rest of the day. And then when they got back downtown, she didn't go sign in with social services, and she never contacted them for assistance again. She gave up on public assistance. She lost all of her cash benefits, food stamps, her Medicaid. She was unemployed and homeless for 8 or 9 months until she finally found a job in a bar. She said, and she found bar work kind of distasteful. She said, I would rather work in a bar than go through that. Even though I wasn't making that much money, I wasn't being disrespected like that or treated like I'm a common piece of trash, because I'm not. Thus, for both workfare and incarcerated workers, the possible punishments they face, as well as the degradation and subjugation they faced on the job, were severe. And that is a key point of difference between them and the student groups in this study. But as we will see, the punitive sticks they face are similarly broad, reaching well beyond the immediate jobs to affect their health and their futures. So for athletes, for example, as I mentioned before, one of the most pervasive punishments they face was a threat of losing playing time. As Mike Smith, the white former basketball player, said to me, if you're not performing well in practice, if you're complaining, if you're an issue, you're just not going to play. For many of these athletes, the possibility of this punishment is significant. They want to play. Many of them are in college in order to play their sport. That's what they came here to do. And because the vast majority of them will not go on to play professionally, this is their only chance. And they actually have a limited number of games and seasons in which to play their sport. So losing any one of those is significant for them indeed. So their coaches have power over this once in a lifetime opportunity. But in point of fact, their coaches have even more power than that. Take, for example, Bruce. He had by far the worst experience among the athletes I interviewed, but his experience reveals some of the punitive levers of power that coaches wield over student athletes. Bruce was a football player in college. He's now 33. He's white. He didn't have any parental support for either his education or his football, so he started off going to a junior college with the hope of being recruited by a larger school the next year so he could go to a state university and get a scholarship. He worked his butt off to make this happen. In fact, he woke up at 4 a.m. every morning to go do speed training. He was paying out of pocket for a speed training coach. And then that year he went to an NFL scouting combine, which is like a recruiting event. And at that combine, he ran one of the fastest times in the country. As a result, when he got back to school, he assumed that coaches from other colleges would be calling him to recruit him to come play for their teams. But he didn't hear anything. He didn't get any calls. But as it turns out, that wasn't the case. Coaches were calling, but they were calling his coach, which is normal practice. And his coach was turning him away. An assistant coach later told him all of this. His head coach was turning them away because his junior college was turning into a four-year college. And the coach wanted to retain Bruce on his team because he was such a good player. So he was turning away all of these offers for scholarships to come play at their schools. When Bruce found out, he was incredibly upset, but by then recruitment season was over. So at the last minute, he contacted a few schools, and the next year was accepted at another school and went the following year as a preferred walk-on. He didn't get a scholarship. Again, he was paying for school out of pocket, but he said to me there was no way he was going to stay at his junior college and play for that coach who had kind of ruined his opportunities. At the state school, when he went the following year, he started at the bottom of their depth chart. He was like the worst player on their list because he's just a walk-on. But after 3 days, he was at the top. He was a legitimately good player, and he had earned a starting position. And he played really well that year. But at the end of the year, Bruce went into the coach's office. And the coach was like, wow, we've never had a walk-on come and contribute the way that you have. We're going to give you the first scholarship that opens up. And Bruce said to me, he said, I'm like crying. I called my mom. That was like the greatest day ever. I was like, finally, now I don't have to work on the side. And, you know, I can kind of relax and like focus on what I'm doing here at school and spend more time studying than on my part-time job. It was the greatest moment. Then after summer break, he went to his coach and he said, hey, I don't know how the scholarship thing works. Like, how do I get my books? Like, what do I need to do for this? And the coach said, oh, yeah, I'm sorry. We never had a scholarship open up. Bruce's heart sank. As he said to me, he could have given me one if he wanted to, but he just knew that in the NC2A, you can't transfer without sitting out a year. And if you transfer your senior year, you're done. So he knew he had me there no matter what. He could use that scholarship to bring in another player. So it was more about him and that program than it was about me. I was a starting player, but like I was asking other kids to borrow their meal cards. That's pathetic and should never be that way. But then Bruce's experience got even worse after that. He was badly injured, but then he was pressured to play through the injury, which made it significantly worse. If they hadn't pushed him to play, he told me, then he might have only had to have minor surgery. He could have gotten a medical red shirt, sat out that year, and preserve that year of eligibility. There are all these rules about how much you can play and how many seasons you can play. But if you're injured, you can sit out a full year and play the following year. But because he played a couple games, he lost that whole year of eligibility. And now, as an MRI showed, his shoulder was torn off the bone, 95% torn off the bone. As Bruce explained to me, you're always trying to make them happy, I guess. And if they want you to play and you're injured, then you're playing. Because you don't want to say no, because then you think, oh, well, he is in control and he can just not play me ever again. And if I have to transfer, then I have to sit out a year. There are just so many variables, like your education, your schooling, where you're at. There's so many things where you just don't want to mess it up. So you're willing to kind of let them control the situation. So in the end, his arm was so bad he couldn't lift his arm. Bruce left the team. He left school. He didn't graduate. In fact, he still hasn't graduated from college. He had to work to earn money. He had to get surgery, which the school did pay for. But when he left, Bruce said, the coach acted like I quit on him, like I quit on the team and stuff. And I was like, I did everything for you. I hurt myself, and now my career is over, and I really wanted to play NFL. And now I have all these student loans. Eventually, Bruce, after the surgery, he was working. He ended up in major debt. And although after years he did eventually get back on his feet, it took him quite a long time. I look back at it, Bruce said later in the interview, and there's just no way that I should have been set back like that behind in life and have to catch up so much. Now, for graduate students, their bodies are not on the line in the same way, though a number of the ones I interviewed did have pretty significant mental health issues. One experienced ongoing panic attacks. Another experienced serious depression stemming from ongoing harassment from her advisor. For these students, and the sciences in particular, their advisors have three overlapping levers of power over their education, their publications, and their future employments. Now, one of the things I was surprised to learn through these interviews is that it's relatively common practice among science labs for faculty advisors to not let their advisees graduate when they've become productive workers in the lab at the end of their tenure as a graduate student. Now, Ron, who is now a chemistry professor, explained it to me in this way. He said, the thing with graduate students is they're terrible, right? They're crap. They're awful in the lab, usually until their final year. And then in their final year, that's when they suddenly learn skills like time management. And they learn, oh, wait, if I do two things at once, that will actually speed up the research. So I've absolutely heard tell of advisors who have essentially prevented their students from coming out for their PhD defense because out of nowhere, they suddenly became productive. And they want to keep them on longer to get more production out of them, right? So when workers, the graduate students in the labs are essentially the hands that do the experiments for their advisors. Advisors are typically the ones who are responsible for obtaining grants. Their graduate students and their postdocs are the ones who are doing the research in the lab. And so advisors' whole kind of career, their tenure cases, their promotion cases, their applications for future funding, their grant and patent applications, all of these are predicated on graduate students' labor in the lab. And when graduate students become good workers in the lab, when they're really productive, there is a real disincentive to letting them graduate. They keep them in the lab. This is what happened to Scott, who got his PhD in molecular biology. He is white, 32 years old. For most of his his tenure as a graduate student, he was the only student in his lab, which is quite unusual, and this slowed down his PhD. But then at the end of his kind of the 4 and 5 year mark, his advisor kept delaying his PhD defense. As Scott said to me, I had 2 to 3 times the amount of experimental work compared to other graduate students, and my advisor kept shifting the goalposts further and further beyond what I still think would have been reasonable. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was used as labor. Thus, by that point, Scott found himself in kind of a catch-22, because on the one hand, his advisor kept delaying his defense, but on the other hand, his advisor had told him that when his funding ran out, and Scott was self-funded, he had 5 years of funding. When his funding ran out, he was going to be out of the lab, whether or not he had defended his dissertation. So Scott was terrified that he would be kicked out without having defended his PhD, and all would be lost. Finally, at the urging of a postdoc who had joined his lab kind of late in his career, he started documenting everything. He created an email trail, kind of documenting the discrepancy between what his advisor was telling him in person versus what he was telling him in emails. He saved copies of emails in non-university accounts. He even got a recording device. And then finally he went to the DGS, though anonymously, because he was terrified of blowback, as he told me. In the end, the DGS, the Director of Graduate Studies, helped him schedule the defense after it had been delayed 3 times. But even though he did finally get to graduate, because of all that, Scott said that he couldn't rely on his advisor for a letter of recommendation. To this day, he told me, if I had asked him for a letter of recommendation, then I don't know what would have happened. His fear, he explained, was that his advisor would write him a bad letter to sabotage his career. As Scott said, the vast majority of advisors are not like this, but for the ones that do decide to abuse their power, there's very little to stop it. And this is true for all of these workers. There are no mechanisms in place that mitigate the power, the punitive power that their bosses wield over them. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions now.
Yay. Excellent job. Are there questions from the audience?
I have a question. Thank you for that great talk, Erin. Can you hear me?
Yes, although
Okay,
I don't know who's talking.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all that.
I'm not sure who is talking.
Oh, hi, my name is Nicole.
Oh, hi,
Um,
Nicole.
Hi, I'm wondering in terms of how you're conceptualizing um, status coercion and the ramifications of these supervisors. How much does it matter that some of them work for the state and are acting in the name of the state and some of them are not?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, I think at heart, I conceptualize all of these bosses as actors of state power and enforcers of state discipline. But obviously in the first two, that connection is much more direct. For the students, it's certainly more indirect. It's less kind of a overt form of punitive state power. But I do think that they are wielding state power in these ways over these workers. And it's just more or less overt for different groups. I'm not sure what kind of differences that makes for these workers. I would have to think more about that, and I'm happy for you to push me more on that if you think it does create differences across these groups. But I do think that they're all actors of state power.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in here. We have a question from Sarah Lageson in the chat. And she says, I'm curious about your recruitment for all of these groups. How did you find interviewees?
Yeah, good question. So every single one, I reinvented the wheel, and it all took a really long time. So for the former prisoners, I had initially intended to go into the prison system, into New York State prisons to interview prisoners there and to hopefully see the type of work they were doing and so on. The New York State prison system would absolutely not let me in. So plan B, I worked with a variety of different service providers for recently released prisoners, and I got to informants that way. So they had just recently come out of prison, New York State prisons. Welfare recipients were a little bit of a mixed bag. I did end up interviewing a lot of welfare recipients at workfare sites. They, at least in some instances, they spend quite a lot of time hanging around. They kind of have to be there, but they're not doing anything, which they feel particularly frustrated about, by the way. And so, at least in some cases, I interviewed workers as they're kind of just hanging around the workfare sites. I also got connected to some of those workers through advocacy organizations. And then for the two student groups, that was really through snowball sampling. I did not interview any students who were connected with my university in any way, past or present. And I felt really strongly about that. I did not want to particularly interview like student athletes from UB, University of Buffalo. That is not offering them much anonymity at all. So through a variety of personal and professional connections, I also went to a conference on student athletes. I ended up getting connected through various professional organizations and people who connected me to people who connected me to others. So I talked to, and both of those groups were former students. So they were graduate students who had already graduated or left graduate school without having graduated. In a couple instances, though most of them had gotten their PhDs, or student athletes who, some of them were playing professionally, basketball or football, but most of them were not, and they had graduated from college in the past 10 years or so.
Great, other questions?
I have a question. This is Tobias Smith over here at UC Berkeley. I'm a PhD candidate in the Jurisprudence and Social Policy program. Erin, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I've been thinking a lot about the very early slides and the framing around coercion versus precarity. You said that the literature tends to frame these questions around precarity, and you're identifying a distinction between economic and status-based power. And I'm wondering about how this fits with social theory on social capital versus economic capital, and in particular how they can be fungible. So in your interviews and your field work, where you might have seen people converting coercion or status coercion into economic coercion or back and forth, or to what degree they can be traded? If that question makes any sense.
Yeah, let's see, that's interesting. I don't know if I'm going to answer this adequately because I would need to think more about this. I do think that these are levers of power that bosses can wield in different ways in different labor relations. And certainly they can combine, right? So the threat of, so for example, as Noah Zat's work has shown, and others I'm sure, many people who are embroiled in the criminal justice system in one way or another are effectively coerced into precarious, shitty jobs. And this type of criminal justice coercion, right, they have to maintain a job and pay child support at risk, and if they don't, they could be incarcerated. So this type of kind of criminal justice coercion and what I would call status coercion also allows for a greater degree of economic coercion and just employer power in general. So these are kind of, can be intertwining mechanisms of employer control. I'm just kind of like analytically separating them, although for practical purposes, they can often be totally intertwined. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you.
I know Mike had a question.
Yeah, hi Erin, good to see you, great talk. I have several questions, but I'm only going to ask one. So you mentioned early on that there's other forms of laborers who are exposed to this sort of coercion, and the example you gave was like citizen workers. And so it made me curious how different sorts of like vulnerable statuses, such as being a non-citizen and being a prisoner, for instance, could overlap and maybe shape in different ways, or maybe even exacerbate coercion. So could, incarcerated foreign national, for instance, experience, different forms or extents of this coercion?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because of their intersecting powers of their vulnerable position, right, as both a non-citizen, able to be effectively deported by their employer, as well as incarcerated if they're implicated in the criminal justice system at all. It's interesting, there are kind of different levers of power that can kind of come together for certain populations. And you can see that on a much more mundane level as well for regular workers. So like I mentioned in the talk, regular workers also experience this, right? There are real kind of psychological and physiological consequences for workers who are unemployed. And it's not just about the economic loss, although that's very important. It's also about the loss of status, of being an upstanding contributor to society, which is the role of work gives to them. And so for those workers who experience that loss, as well as the ones perhaps who signed non-complete causes in the tech sector or whatever sector, right? There are these kind of compounding levers that can work to, that can intersect to compound their vulnerability in that position. But it's interesting, I haven't fully explored all of those kind of interstices of accumulation of this power.
Cool, thanks.
Other questions? And if you are like kind of formulating a question and want to just get in the queue, go ahead and put something in the chat and just say like, me at some point.
I do have a question. Erin, thank you very much for this talk. I'm going to try to formulate in a question, but it's more of a train of thought that I cannot clarify in my mind, and maybe you can help me. And definitely this talk is helping me. And this is how it goes. So I'm trying to think so in other words, how capitalism evolves in a way that at different point in times, it creates these type of situations which I see as unveiling the general coercion that capitalism produces towards wage labor. I don't know if I explain myself. I'm trying to explain myself. So in other words, to put it in more simple terms, so Marx, when analyzes the exploitation, he goes much further than economic. But in many ways, wage labor has evolved in a way that tries to put a veil into those types of coercion. And what I'm seeing from this work is that in these specific pockets that you are talking about, that veil goes down and we see that coercion exposed. So I'm wondering what dynamics are in place that create these type of situations in which we cannot put the veil anymore and talk about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I have a couple of different answers that I hope address it adequately. So one reason that there is no veil is that these groups that I study aren't considered workers. And so they're these other things. And as such, these type of punishments are seen as totally justifiable. Like, and also, so along with that, they're not workers, they're these other things. And as in chapter 1 of my book, I analyze the cultural narratives around these groups of workers. And so for the two student groups, they're culturally framed as incredibly privileged. They're lucky to be where they are, and there are thousands of people who would take their place at the drop of a hat. And many of these workers themselves embrace this rhetoric of privilege. And this, I mean, it's a little bit like academics as well. This rhetoric of privilege can take the place of personal understanding of themselves as workers. And that kind of worker ideology and collective sense of collectivity that can build worker resistance to difficult labor conditions. Okay, so for them, there's this rhetoric of privilege. For the other two groups, the prisoners and workfare workers, there's this rhetoric of immorality and criminality. In both cases, these rhetorics justify their treatment as people who need to be controlled, need to be regulated, need to be subdued, need to be governed by their bosses. So they're not seen as workers with rights. They're not seen as workers as upstanding, productive, economically valuable citizens. Rather, they're seen as people who are problems to society, who need to be governed, controlled, and punished often. Or they're seen as lucky recipients of state governance, of kind of paternalism, of benevolence, certainly, especially for athletes, but less so, and still true for the graduate students. They're lucky to be where they are, and they just need to do what their bosses say, and they call their advisors bosses. So I think it's because that they are not seen as workers culturally or legally, and that these other rhetorics kind of justify these often quite punitive punishments, that this veil is lifted. So with our modern forms of capitalism, we have at least sought, very minimally, sought to mitigate the punitive power of economic coercion that bosses can wield. So now we have the American welfare state. So we have unemployment and the minimum wage and overtime. We impose a pretty paltry and weak set of benefits and protections so that to mitigate that type of coercion, that type of power. But for these workers, there's no mitigation. Their power is fully endorsed by the state, and it's seen as correct that coaches totally control what athletes can do, whether they can play professionally, whether they can play at all, that advisors totally control the present and future research and career of graduate students, and so on. Did that answer your question more or less?
Yes, thank you very much.
So we have another question in the chat, this one from Michelle Phelps, and she writes, perhaps an obvious question, but can you talk a bit about how your work on this book is shaping your perspective on the social and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic? For example, are there things missing in the public discourse about mass unemployment that your work highlights?
That's an interesting question. I do think that, I mean, as researchers who study unemployment or the experiences of unemployed people will tell you, that loss of status is really, really important and devastating. Over Sharon's book is a really great example. It is slightly tempered in those historical moments where there's mass unemployment. So these are at least historically the moments when unemployment is not seen as that person's fault. Whereas in most, quote, normal times when people experience unemployment or other economic hardships or welfare or so on, it's seen they're entirely blamed for that problem. But with this moment of mass unemployment, there is this cultural recognition that the victims are victims, that they are blameless, and so that may then mitigate their experience of that loss of status. And of course, it feels at this moment, at least, temporary. So it's a good question. I think it's one that we'll have to see how it plays out. But as happened in the Great Depression, that was the first time that, in at least recent history at that moment, that kind of middle and upper classes experience unemployment, and suddenly they're like, oh goodness, everyone needs benefits, we need benefits, this is not our fault, we want to work, whereas those other people, those poor people, don't want to work. And I think that you could certainly see that playing out again here. Sorry, that was a bit rambling, but I hope I addressed your question.
So I have a question, but are there other questions before I go ahead and jump in? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask, and again, please feel free to keep using the chat. So you discussed how we see status coercion in these kind of less obvious cases of workers, student athletes, prisoners, and so on. I'm thinking about status coercion outside of labor relations. So like even kind of far removed to cases where like it's like really not officially labor, even though you're looking at cases that are kind of also not labor, but we can at least recognize them as labor. So for example, sticking with grad students, those who aren't necessarily working for their advisors, but they're just students. So they're like officially students, they're doing their own research. So their advisors are still kind of their bosses, but not in that kind of work sense. So they also experience coercion to perform or behave in a particular way in order to maintain their status and get their letters of recommendations. Likewise, with prisoners, even outside of the labor experience, they also experience pressure to behave within these rules, whether they're real or not, written or not, or they lose their status of good standing. And so what I'm wondering is, am I just basically watering down your concept by kind of saying status coercion is everywhere? Or is that actually also kind of part of the point, is that it really is everywhere?
I don't think it's watering down the point at all. I think you're absolutely right. So for our graduate students who are not performing labor for us in the same way that they're in the sciences, that is still entirely a relationship predicated on status coercion. And the same with all prisoners outside of their work. It's just really because I'm a work scholar that I was focusing on these as labor relations, that I'm identifying this as a form of labor power. But it's also just a form of power that operates outside of labor relations as well. So if anything, I would say, it just kind of shows its ubiquity, at least in some institutions and in some settings, rather than watering down it. That was just my particular focus as a form of labor governance. But it is a form of power that can be wielded in social hierarchies.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Hi, this is Nicole Kaufman again. I've got another question, but I don't want to jump the line if someone else has one.
Go for it.
Okay, I was wondering, in your interviews with people who had been incarcerated, if they compared at all, or if your questions allowed them to compare at all between their experiences of coercion during and after incarceration, or even before.
That's a really good question. And generally, no, in part because I was interviewing them so recently after having been released. They didn't have a ton of, do you mean coercion on the job after incarceration?
Yes.
Yeah, they hadn't had yet a ton of labor market experience. Like some might have gotten some temp jobs and so on, but I was really focusing on coercion behind bars, on the work experience behind bars. But one thing that did come up with a few of the folks I interviewed, and something that I would like to follow up in future research, is how they talked about the work that they did behind bars and kind of the shittiness and coercive nature of that labor, or the low wages that they got. They would say things to me like, how could I not come out here and take any job, even if it was a stepping stone, even if what they're saying, even if it was the shittiest work you can imagine? How could I not appreciate that work when I was paid so little behind bars, or when I was treated like that behind bars? And so in a way, one of my side arguments in the book is that these type of coercive labor relations really do prime workers to accept substandard work in other fields. So for graduates, we see, graduate students, I mean, there's this widespread acceptance of incredibly precarious adjunct labor, underpaid, low wage, insecure adjunct labor. With prisoners, we see an incredible acceptance, for lack of a better choice, often they might be incarcerated again, of acceptance of shitty work after they get out of prison. And the same for welfare recipients, right? There's a push to, and the same for graduate students as well. For graduate students in the sciences, they often end up in postdocs. Now postdocs are lasting upwards of 10 years. So insecure, long-term, don't know when it's gonna end, underpaid labor. So there is definitely a link, I think, between the difficult and coercive and substandard working conditions of these labor relations and how it primes them for substandard, more precarious, economically coercive labor in the mainstream labor market.
Thanks.
Hi, Erin. This is Mandy Hewitt. I really enjoyed your talk, and you said at one point you were talking a little bit about how these imprisoned people continued to resist in sort of subtle and not so subtle ways, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that. And I ask because I'm interested in the ways that prison officials use these kinds of privileges attached to work as a managerial tool. And so I'm wondering to what extent people are able to resist this kind of coercion, and what role, if any, does it sort of play in suppressing resistance behind bars?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I spend a lot of time on resistance in my book. And so, the big argument is really that this type of coercion, the power that officers wield, is very effective in suppressing resistance. That said, there were different ways that these workers resisted. Oftentimes in prison, it was quite subterranean. So one of the ways that I analyzed how they resist was either through avoidance or even compliance, which is kind of funny to categorize that as a form of resistance. But one of the most common things that they did was that they would just avoid officers so that they wouldn't be put in a position of abuse of power, they told me. And that's not always easy. Or like one former prisoner I interviewed said, like officers would like try to joke to him, like try to be buddy, and he wouldn't go for it. He would not, he would like do the work, he would do what he needed to do, but he refused to be buddy with them. So either he would like go out of his way to avoid being around them altogether, and or when they kind of tried to foist their interactions upon him, he refused to do it. And he said to me, he said, if I do joke along with him, then I'm just setting myself up for disappointment, for disaster, for hardship, for subjugation. Because when they come and put me down, which they're going to, because that's their job, then I ask for it because I open myself up to them by pretending to be friends with them. And so this type of kind of compliance plus avoidance was a common strategy that I analyze as a form of resistance. But of course, there were moments of collective action. There were moments of resistance. For instance, one worker I interviewed, the punishment that his boss, it was actually a civilian boss, went into wield for him falling asleep at work, like twice in a row, or the first time he did fall asleep, the second time he said he did not. But his boss said he did, and his boss wanted him to scrub the floor with a toothbrush. And he was like, nope, not gonna happen. Come here, put the handcuffs on me now, I'll go to the box because what are you talking about scrubbing the floor with a toothbrush? So they would just refuse. And oftentimes they also refused to do things that were particularly dirty work, like cleaning up feces or urine or things without proper equipment. So they did refuse outright, and they took the consequences or those punishments that they found particularly degrading. But for the most part, but because that type of refusal really opened themselves up to severe punishment, physical abuse, solitary confinement, most often it was more kind of subterranean forms of resistance that were like the compliance avoidance combo, where they just did what they needed to do to comply just enough, but not too much, in order to maintain their parole date and get out as soon as they could. Did that answer your question, Mandy?
Yes, thank you.
All right, any last questions? So I think that's it. Let's go ahead and